We would now like to answer your questions. As we always do at these events, we will take our questions in groups of threes. Please speak into the microphone when it's passed to you. My colleagues Dan and Rebecca will be walking around with their roving microphones. Identify yourself and your news organization, please. So to start off, yes, we have Nick over here, the gentleman immediately in front of him. Nick is, yes, on the other side. Nick is in the third row. We'll do three. Go ahead, Nick.
Thanks very much, Nick from Arcus. Firstly, Mexico. I just wonder if you could say anything about Mexico, given its recent declared ambitions to reform its oil sector, and what you think the obstacles are and the outlook for Mexico. And the other, more of a climate issue, and you mentioned the debates around subsidies for renewables. I wonder if I could draw you into that debate a bit more as far as Europe is concerned. Your views on the multiple climate targets that Europe has. Are they heavy-handed, or is a bit of economic damage the price to be paid for reducing carbon emissions? Thank you.
Okay. And next up, right in front of Nick. And we'll do this gentleman here with his hand up as well.
Matthew Carr from Bloomberg News. You suggest in the report that the energy price differentials will potentially cause big changes in the market share of energy-intensive exports. Can you tell us how you think countries should respond to the big differentials in prices so that there's more of a level playing field for the economies?
Yeah, hi. Danny O'Sullivan from LPG and World Markets. You've gone into quite a lot of detail around page 539 on routes to market for NGLs. With regard to condensate splitters in particular, you appear to be saying that even by 2020, the volume of NGLs going through condensate splitters is going to more or less double. Not quite, but quite a significant increase. Now, obviously, condensate splitters have been a fairly static segment, over the past few years. There is some underutilization, but I'm wondering, where do you see this new capacity coming? Have you just said the condensate is coming, so the splitters will come, or do you have a view on which specific regions will be developing new splitter capacity? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Danny. I think, Mrs. van der Hoeven, you'll start off with some comments on Mexico?
Just a general comment on Mexico, because it's very interesting what's happening there at the moment, where the whole country is really looking at what's happening in Mexico City, because the debate on the policy reforms in the energy sector will be there this week and next week. What I think is interesting, that this debate in Parliament, and it's also about, of course, about the position of Pemex, really shows that the government is extremely interested in seeing that for the future there will be a different kind of situation in Mexico, which will also have an opportunity to attract foreign investments. I was also very much, how shall I put it, impressed by the President's remarks this week and last week's about how he thinks the reform should go to. So we are looking into that with a lot of interest, but of course this is not in this book. What's in the book, that's Fatih going to explain.
Thank you very much, Maria. In fact, what we see in Brazil today, in the absence of the reforms that are being discussed, which Maria mentioned, we see a decline in the Mexico's oil production. Today it is about 2.9%, 2.9 million barrels per day, and we expect that this will slightly decline about 2.6 million barrels per day in 2035. And this is not because of the resource issue, because it's mainly because of the investment issue, because we see a significant decline in the existing resource base. But if the president's and the government's reforms and intentions sees the light of the day, and if the investment pours in, and if the investments are made, then this declining trend may well be reversed, and we may see an increase from Mexico. Now, before I go to the condensate question, let me talk about how the competitiveness issue. This is mainly an issue for Europe and Japan. For Europe, there are a few things that Europe can do. The first one is improving the energy efficiency, especially in the industrial sector. There is a huge room there, and Europe can definitely make use of that and to reduce the cost of energy. Second, again, Europe may well look at the gas markets carefully. About 2/3 of the existing contracts in Europe are expiring within the next 10 years, which is tomorrow. And Europe can renegotiate those gas contracts in the light of the current gas markets. When those current contracts were made 10 years ago, markets were the markets of the sellers. But it is now turning more and more to be a markets of buyers, and Europe has the chances, strong hands, like other gas importers, to make a major renegotiation there and bring the prices down. This is second. Third, Europe may well look at the renewable energy subsidies issue. Renewables are crucial to address the climate change. I forgot the first question. I can combine with the second part of the first question. Renewable subsidies are crucial for, in many cases, but the design of the renewable subsidies should also consider not to put excessive burden on the consumers and the economy. So there is a need for that. Another issue for Europe, in some countries in Europe, there are significant amount of shale gas resources, which may not be available immediately, but if we work towards that in a sustainable way, under the strict environmental regulations that we have proposed in our report last year, that again Maria and myself presented here, namely golden rules for a golden age of gas, we may see Europe to have its own domestic production. This would also help. But from Europe's point of view, if I can say one final thing, it has rarely been so critical in the European economic history to have sound energy policies for the prosperity of Europe. So we have to be very careful here. In terms of condensates, where does it come from? It is mainly from North America, Middle East, Russia, and Africa. And of course, as we all know, NGLs are growing in general very strongly, from 30 million barrels per day today to 18 million barrels per day. And most of them are light products, and it goes directly to the petrochemical sector. But these are the areas where the condensates come from. Greg? Pardon me? Where do you think the new splitters will be going? It is mainly in Middle East, we think.
Okay, next round. Yes, in the back, then Junior, and the gentleman here with his hand up on the aisle.
Derek Brown from Petroleum Economist. Your oil demand projection for 2035 is about 8 million barrels per day less than OPEC's last week. Wonder if you could comment on this discrepancy, which is pretty big for the oil market.
Thank you. Junior?
Hi, Junior Arles with the Energy Industry Times. You said that the design of renewable subsidies shouldn't put a burden on consumers. Can you expand on that?
Sohei Ide from Kyodo News, Japan. It's a very alarming forecast about the loss of market share for Europe and Japan. But how much of that loss of competitiveness is due to the price of electricity? Because, you know, in the same page we see China, who has just as wide as energy price gap vis-a-vis US, actually increasing the share. So if you could put a figure on that, that would be great. And also, could you single out maybe one or two most important measures in order to reduce the energy use for Europe and well, you talked about Europe, so Japan. Thank you.
I'll start with one of the questions, and then Fatih will follow. I would like to make a few comments on the renewable subsidies. First is that in a number of countries, in a number of regions, we can see, for instance, wind, onshore wind, being competitive. Solar sometimes is, but also will still need a lot of subsidy, targeted subsidy. We see hydro being competitive in most of all the countries. But what is important, that is that although this renewable subsidy is needed, this support is needed for renewables, there's also something else that is needed, and that is a stable framework. If you change the law, if you change the regulations all the time, then it's very difficult to have a stable investment climate, for instance. My second remark is on the feed-in tariffs. We have seen in Europe a couple of PV bubbles. And they were there because the feed-in tariffs were too generous, was one thing. There was produced too much solar energy, and the solar energy, for instance, in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, could not get onto the grid and could not get to the rest of Europe because interconnection was not okay. So that means that although renewables need to be supported, but the support has to be targeted in such a way that first, when technology develops and costs go down, your tariffs have to go down. So there has to be a flexible element in your tariffs. Second, because of this enormous growth of renewables, it's of the utmost importance to see to it that the grid infrastructure can manage that. And this is something that's not really there everywhere. And my second remark, like in Japan, feed-in tariffs were quite high. Now they are coming down. When I was there last year and I heard about their amount of feed-in tariffs, I said to them, "Are you sure? Are you sure? Do you know what it's going to cost you? Not only this year, but in 5 to 10 years' time." Well, I think they know now, and that's why they did something about it. Then about the renewable subsidies as such, yes, we will need them. Yes, we will need more of them, but they need to be targeted and seen to it that what we expect that renewables will be, a very, very important part of power generation, is going to be affected in the near future.
Thank you, Maria. The second two other questions, why OPEC and IEA numbers are different. I wouldn't say that we are 8 million barrels per day less than OPEC. I think I would say that OPEC is 8 million barrels per day higher than us, so first of all, to start with. And the reason here is the following. We, in our scenario, we show you, we see an efficiency improvement, especially in the transportation sector. We take this into account. In the next years to come, and many countries are in the process of putting this efficiency measures, and I believe this is the main reason, in addition to perhaps the differences and the economic growth assumption between OPEC and the IEA, but the main trend is very similar, strong growth of oil demand, and therefore oil still stays as the most important fuel for many years to come. In terms of what can we do in terms of competitiveness of Japan and why China is not suffering that much, first of all, energy costs are one of the three major costs of the industry. The others are labor and capital costs. And I think when we compare Japan and China in the labor and capital costs, there is a strong, significant difference there. And when it comes to Japan, what can Japan do? One of them, Maria mentioned already, renewable subsidies, look at carefully. But the two others are also, I have to mention, one of the major issues in Japan is today the role of nuclear power. I think it is very important for Japan to think carefully whether or not to go back to at least in a gradual way to the use of nuclear power, while it will help to keep the electricity prices down. I think this is a very important issue, which I think the Japanese government, Japanese colleagues are discussing nowadays. And the third one, renewable subsidies, nuclear, and the third one would be I mentioned the natural gas prices, because Japan is importing a huge amount of natural gas today, and it will be very wise for Japan to look at the new opportunities more and more, LNG, especially coming from the North America, and use this as a catalyst in order to make the reforms and changing the structure of gas pricing and bring the gas prices down. In Japan, this is very important. Beyond the competitiveness is electricity or energy price differentials. And after Fukushima, when we look at the situation, the current trade deficit of Japan, in the 14 years in a row, we see this trade deficit. It has been only once in the 14 months of a trade deficit, only once, which was only 79-80 we saw during the oil crisis. This is the second time happening. So therefore, I think for Japan, it is very important to have the right sound energy policies too for the well-being of the Japanese economy for the next years to come.
Yes. Sarah in the front, the gentleman in the back, and the woman at the far back, please.
Sarah Kent with the Wall Street Journal. You mentioned that the US would become the biggest oil producer in the world by 2015. How long will that last, given what you were saying about light tight oil production reaching a plateau? And I also wondered if you could elaborate on what impact growing Middle East consumption would have on trade flows.
Growing Middle East consumption.
Thank you. My name is Kato from Nikkei, Japanese business paper. And I have one question regarding coal. You mentioned the emerging country are focusing on coal-fired plant, and nowadays, and on the contrast, and in Europe, European utilities wants to use more coal-fired plant compared to a higher cost gas-fired plant. So how do you evaluate the potential of coal? And could you say there gas and golden age of coal in the future? That's all. Thank you.
Valerie Flynn, I'm a journalist at ENDS Europe. From your figures, it seems like fossil fuel subsidies outstrip renewable subsidies by about a ratio of about 5 to 1. Do you expect that to continue, or do you think renewable subsidies will begin to close that gap? And is it possible for you to draw some sort of link between the rate of fossil fuel subsidies and this emissions trend towards 3.6 degrees temperature increase or whatever? Thanks.
Yeah, okay. I would like to make a few comments on the coal question. Actually, coal is the biggest elephant in the room. And many people just think that, because nobody, for instance, or less people in Europe are talking about coal, that coal isn't there anymore. But coal is there in a very important way, and coal is there to stay. And, I would like to draw your attention to our medium-term market report on coal, which will be released next month, and which will look into all these things more from a medium-term perspective. What we can see is that in many countries with rapidly growing power demand, it's coal. And why is it coal? Because it's abundant, because it's low cost. And we can also see that this coal supply chain is not, how should I put it, very technically sophisticated, and that standard coal-fired plants can easily be built by local companies, allowing for rapid increases in generating capacity. And that's exactly what we can see at this moment, for instance, happening in China. Now, what you also see is that we assume the introduction of a carbon price in China from 2020 onwards. And then, when there is a CO2 price, that really gives a very, very strong economic incentive to first dispatch the most efficient power plants and to dispatch old inefficient plants only when they are indispensable. So this CO2 price really favors investments in highly efficient plants that would otherwise not be built. Now, one of the 4 measures proposed in our special report regarding the climate energy map is to limit the use of least efficient coal power plants. And this is exactly one of the things that is happening, for instance, in the United States, when we are talking about plans and regulations that will be there in the near future, for instance, about new to be power plants, coal-fired power plants that will be newly built. And what we do expect, that is that within their climate action plan, these emission standards will not only be there for new power plants, but will also affect the position of the existing power plants. Now, coming back to the EU, what we can see there is that at this moment, the coal is cheaper than gas, and it means, for instance, in a country like the Netherlands, my country, but also in Germany, that some of our gas-run power generation plants are not running anymore, or running at very low level, and that instead it's coal that comes back into the scene. The question is whether this will be a trend that will be there for 5, 10, 15 years to come. I'll come back to that in our midterm medium market report on coal.
For the other two questions, we think that the US, being the number one producer, will continue to 2025, mid-2020s, and at the end of the 2035, Saudi Arabia, for example, is going to produce at least 1.5 million barrels per day more oil than United States. But this something is very important to understand. You compare US and Saudi Arabia, who produces what, how much. This is it's a statistical issue. The main issue is the export. US doesn't export anything. It is Saudi Arabia who exports and meets the growth in the oil demand, whereas US uses most of the oil at home to meet its own oil consumption. This is definitely good news for US, but for the global markets, what matters is the Saudi Arabia is and will remain the largest oil exporter of the world for many years to come. Secondly, Middle East consumption, what is its role in the international oil trade? It will, of course, slow down the growth in the oil trade between Gulf and Asia. So the main energy trade axis is becoming very clear. Iron X from Gulf to Asia. This is the new link, instead of what we have been seeing in the past, Atlantic to be the main area of trade. It is moving there and in an everyday growing way, and therefore it is, as I said, not only important from a trade point of view, but also from an energy security point of view. Malacca Strait. The oil which will go through Malacca Strait in the next 20 years will increase by 50%, 50%. And this will have definitely implications for the oil security, and therefore it is an issue that we, as the International Energy Agency, putting a lot of emphasis in our countries, but beyond those. Finally, on the amount of the renewable subsidies, today, as I said, there are about 100 billion, and we expect if the policies do not change, and some of the policies cannot change because they are legally enacted and already locked in, we expect that these subsidies will be doubled, reach about 220 billion US dollar in 2035. And as I said, the significant part of it is already locked in if the governments do not retrieve their already enacted policies. And as such, they will on one hand give a good hand to the renewable energy growth, but on the other hand will have implications for the electricity prices and markets, as Maria explained. But for the fossil fuel subsidies, we should understand that in many cases fossil fuel subsidies are in different countries than the renewable subsidies are put together. About half of the 544 billion US dollar subsidies are in Middle East countries, main and oil products, but the rest in Asia. So we can compare in the global terms, but in a country terms, there are very few countries who has On one hand, the fossil fuel subsidies, on the other hand, the renewable subsidies. But fossil fuel subsidies, looking at from every angle, very clear. It is bad for the budget of the country, bad for the environment, bad for efficiency, and very bad for the poor people. Our analysis show that about 544 billion US dollar, only 8% of this money goes to 20% lowest income groups, and more than 90% of the fossil fuel subsidies go to medium and higher income groups, highlighting the very fact that the fossil fuel subsidies do not, as some politicians say, help the poor, but it is more the medium and higher income groups who benefit from that, and the loss maker utilities, the electricity utilities in those countries, since they cannot generate revenues, they are not able to make investments, infrastructure investments, from which the poor people once again suffer.
Thank you. This will be our last round of questions. We have one here in the front, Ron, and then David.
Hi. Thank you very much. My name is Mikio Sugeno. I'm a senior staff correspondent of the Nikkei Japanese Daily. I'm interested in the analysis of the competitiveness, and I understand that you want to regard Europe as a single market, and that is a EU. I'm just wondering whether you can elaborate a bit more of the breakdown within the European countries, among which there are so many different politics, like energy vendor in Germany, or on the other hand, France or UK. If you can say any general comments, I would be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ron Buxa from Reuters. Fatih, just one follow-up to the question to the U.S. becoming the largest oil producer. Could we have a number? Let's say 2015 or 16, will it become the largest? What kind of volumes are we dealing with? And for Maria, just a question. You touched on this issue, mentioning the Malacca Straits. How does the IEA see itself playing a bigger role as the global oil market shifts from the OECD to non-member countries, India, China? Obviously, the question of SPRs is a rising issue. How do you see that in your evolution? Thanks.
Hi, David Strawn, freelance. Interested that you see these price differentials persisting pretty much through the forecast period, but still a little unclear about what you think is going to happen to prices, oil, coal, gas and electricity in Europe and Britain. And more particularly, what will be the relationship between those prices? They've obviously moved very closely in the past. Are they going to become decoupled, wholly decoupled, partially, or what relationship will there be between those different commodities?
The point with the EU is that's not a country. It's not a country. It's a big deal of countries, and they all have their own policies, their own national policies when it comes down to energy. Also, I have to admit that things like, for instance, the addition with the third energy package, the energy efficiency directives, they are very interesting, and I think they are good steps forward, and so are others. For instance, if you don't do that, you will not have a liberalized energy market, and that's exactly what is needed in Europe. But it needs quite some time before we have a really competitive, completely interconnected internal energy market. But it's on its way into that direction, so that's fine. We can also see there are quite some different national policies on renewables, where in country A, the subsidy on renewables are much higher than in another country. Another thing we still see, that is, I mentioned there, that grid interconnection between the countries is not yet completed. Sometimes even within a country, northern and southern Germany, it's not yet completed. So there are quite some challenges there. The same goes for the gas market. Also in the gas market we can see very promising developments, and also a country like UK is benefiting from that. The other question I would like to take, it's about how IEA sees itself, and I can imagine that it's quite a question given the redrawing of the energy map, and we see that when the IEA started, 2/3 of energy demand came from the OECD countries, and now in 2035 we expect it to be not more than 1/3. And it's not because we are using less, but it's because the others are developing fast and are using more. So what we can see, for instance, in countries like these emerging economies, is that they are thinking their policy, for instance, about what should we have stocks? Should we have stocks on crude? What about our responses if there is a problem? Well, you mentioned the Strait of Malacca. What happens? What should countries like that do if something happens in the Strait of Malacca? What's IEA doing in that respect? At this moment, we have with a growing number of countries, but also with countries like Russia, China, India, Indonesia, to mention just a couple, but also with other countries in Asia, like Thailand. We have bilateral agreements on how to develop a number of issues in data and analysis capacity, because if you don't have sound data, if you don't have sound analysis, it's very difficult for you to have sound policy decisions. So that's one thing. What about emergency responses, so that other countries can learn from what the experience of the 28 IEA countries? Although I have to say in future it will be 29 because of the accession of Estonia. All these things, and it will be quite fast. I can see from your face you want to know when. Well, we hope that we can invite them to be a member next week, because they met all the requirements, and Minister Paas from Estonia will be present at our ministerial next week. That ministerial is not only inviting member countries and Chile as an accession country and Estonia as the new country to be, as the new member to be, but also the 7 countries, of which I mentioned 4, but also a country like Brazil, South Africa, and Mexico. And we are during that ministry, we are going to sign our next bunch of bilateral agreements, bilateral action plans, bilateral programs with all these countries. And I think this shows that not only IEA, but also the emerging economies know that there is something in it to win. There is a benefit for both groups, and there can be a win-win situation. Let me just give you one example. We have implementing agreements in which companies, governments cooperate on a certain issue. A country like China is member at this moment of 17, 18, 19, 17, I know for sure, 17 of our implementing agreements. So this shows how important also a country like China thinks the work of IEA is. And the same goes for other countries. Russia, just my last example. At this moment, IEA is working on an in-depth review of the Russian energy situation. So again, it shows how important that countries who are not a member think the cooperation with IEA can be and will be in the near future.
About oil markets, first of all, the question about the U.S. oil production, we think around 2015 it will be around 11 million barrels per day. And this brings me to the following question of David about the oil prices. Despite this growth from United States, we do not see an era of abundance in the oil markets. And there are at least 2 reasons for that. One, we didn't talk today, but when we look at the conventional crude oil we produce today, worldwide, about 40 million of that conventional crude oil will decline in the next 25 years. We will lose 40 million barrels per day of the existing conventional crude oil capacity. So there is a decline issue, and we worldwide, we produce oil not only meet the growth in the demand, but to compensate the decline in the existing fields. So we do not subscribe that there will be an abundance of oil, and we will see a major decline in the oil prices in a sustained period. There may be ups and downs, but when we look at the cost of oil production throughout the world and the decline and the strong demand growth coming mainly from Asia, first China, then India and the other ASEAN countries, we expect the prices remain $100 and above for many years to come. Of course, this is not a good news for many consuming countries as far as their trade balances and their economies are concerned. The oil and gas prices, are they going to be indexed to each other for the next years? It will depend on how the important countries will be able to A, read the gas markets game, and B, if they are able to use their cards wisely when they negotiate with the major gas exporters. But our expectation is there will be a gradual increasing share of non-oil index contracts pricing in the markets in Europe and perhaps in the future in the Asia-Pacific markets. So this is our expectation.
Thanks very much. That concludes our press conference today. Thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to viewing your articles. Thank you.